The data are clear about the benefits of having a sense of purpose and meaning in life. And one big piece of that for many people is their work. That's because, as we discuss in the Indigo Manifesto, which, by the way, you can check out at indigotogether.com, so many of our waking hours are spent at work. So what makes work meaningful? How might we make our work more meaningful? And what might we do if that's just not possible? In this episode, we discuss. Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com. Yeah, so today's episode is in search of meaningful work and what to do if work stinks.
That's right. And I think we should note that this is a very unusual recording of the Indigo Podcast. And why is it unusual, Chris?
Because I can smell you.
Oh,
No, because we're sitting in the same room.
we are sitting in the same room here in Hudson, Ohio. It's phenomenal to be both in the same place. It's great. So a little bit different for us. But yes, we are talking about meaningful work and what it means, why it matters. We're going to talk about how you can make work more meaningful, and we can talk about what to do if that's just unlikely. And of course, we'll talk about some implications for people, for leaders, and for organizations. So I think we should start with this idea of what is meaningful work and why does it matter? So before we get into kind of the formal discussion of this, what does meaningful work mean for you, Chris?
I mean, I think for me, it's just, hey, am I feeling good about the job, right?
Okay.
I have this internal fire about what I'm doing. And, whenever we talk about these kinds of things, I feel like I get calls from friends or texts saying, oh my gosh, I need out of my job. Help. What can I do to find meaningful work, right? There's this idea of,
But is it different than just job satisfaction, right? Because you said it's like, I feel like I have this feeling about my work. That's just, to me, just sounds like job satisfaction. Is having meaning in your work any different than just job satisfaction?
And we'll get to this in the episode. I think it's just because I bring so much meaning to the stuff I do, right? There's like kind of two things, like either the work can create that meaning for you or you can bring that meaning. So there's so many things in my life that I've had to do that are completely trite and exasperating.
Sure.
Especially anybody who's done any government work. I'm in the Army. There's so many things that we have to do that's just mandated stuff. But I feel okay about it because I bring the meaning. Like times when I've worked for not the best bosses or commanders in the military, like I'm still kind of okay.
Right.
Because I joined because of the mission that I have in my own life, right?
Right. So there's this great book chapter that we came across written by Justin Berg, Jane Dutton, and Amy Rosinski. And this chapter talks about job crafting and meaningful work. And we'll get into what job crafting is all about here in a few minutes. And we of course, we have a link to this article in the show notes. But, there are really a couple different ways to think about meaning. You can think about, bringing your own meaning to work or the work meaning, how the work kind of creates meaning for you, as you just mentioned, Chris. But let's start with the definition of what meaningfulness means with regard to the workplace from this chapter. And what they suggest is that meaningfulness is, and I quote, the amount or degree of significance employees believe their work possesses. So the amount or degree of significance that you think your work has. And then they go on to say, and I continue quoting, meaningfulness is associated with numerous work-related benefits, including increased job satisfaction, motivation, and performance. So when you feel like your work it matters, when it has significance, it's making a dent in the universe, whatever that means to you, it seems like the research is fairly clear that this has positive outcomes for both people and for the organization.
Yeah, there's just so many things. Existentially, we're a speck of dust floating through the cosmos. And when you think about it that way, I think there's benefits to saying, so much of what we do, because we're a blip on this part of the universe and time, doesn't really matter. Yet, when we sit and look at our families the community that we're in, the things that are going on, I don't know, there's just like this fire that builds up and care, right? Care for other people, care for what you're doing. You know, I don't know. I think there's just this tug of war in my mind about this idea of meaning. And the thing is it says the significance that employees believe their work possesses. That means it's got to be different for every single person.
Sure. And as we'll get into, a lot of this has to do with how you think about your job. Some of the early research on this actually came from looking at job design, how jobs are structured, looking at things like job characteristics, how much autonomy do you have, and how much feedback do you get, and the task identity. And one big piece of that is what we call task significance. And task significance is all about that the extent to which you can see a connection between what you're doing at work and its influence in something bigger, right? So, are you doing something that matters, or is it just meaningless? I remember back when I was a senior in high school, we had to pick an author in my AP English class, and we had to read a lot of their literature and also read historical accounts and critiques of their literature and do big report and everything. And I picked Dostoevsky. And Dostoevsky wrote a number of books, and most commonly known for Crime and Punishment and for the Brothers Karamazov. But one other book that he wrote was called The House of the Dead, and it was about prison life. And he suggests in that book that one of the most punishing things you can do to a person is to have them go out and dig a hole all day long, and then at the end of the day, fill it back in, right? I mean,
I'm just reflecting on how many things I've done in my life that are exactly. Matter of fact, maybe digging the hole is more meaningful because you'd at least get some lawn aeration out of it.
I guess, right? So, but it's this idea that we're doing something that matters, that it's not just busy work. And some tasks that we do at work have this, some don't. But that's what we're talking about when we talk about task significance. Can you think of anything in your life, in your work, where you did something that felt like it was connected to something that mattered?
Yeah, I think a lot, I'm a secular person now, but a lot of, probably the most significance I had in my life was doing church work, honestly, from the, like hospital visitation to preparing music with choirs and that kind of community, and that we're building to some kind of goal, that we're operating ethically in the community. Those were really significant times for me. And then definitely some times in the military. I joined the military based on, articles that were in the paper talking about how people were getting out because the op tempo was so high in Iraq. And I said, if my country really has to pay a bunch of bonuses to officers and stuff like that, then maybe I should throw my hat in the ring, because this bigger idea about, I don't know, the idea that America, and they don't always live up to this, but it's definitely this aspirational idea that we could be an example or a city on a hill. And, well, that's going to require a lot of people getting their hat in the ring and actually doing something to be that, right?
Right. Yeah, I can think certainly of my experiences in the military as having, those times where I really felt like I was doing something that mattered. That it was, being part of a big team that was doing something important. And then, of course, there are, my work as a professor. I get to, influence, lots of MBA students and other people who are getting their education. And I get to see them, on LinkedIn getting promoted and having other kinds of accomplishments and seeing the cool things that they're doing in the world. And sometimes getting feedback from them saying that something that I did in class or a course that they took with me really mattered. And that means a lot. That's a piece of task significance. And, in my research, maybe somebody cites it or reads it and it makes a difference there as well. And then even in our consulting work that we do, Chris, together, I think there is some significance that we've derived there from helping an organization work better and, making it more efficient, making it more effective, helping the people thrive more in the organization. That's where I think that if you approach even management consulting in a certain way with a high degree of ethics and integrity, it really can be noble work where you're helping organizations work better, helping leaders perform better, and all of those types of things.
Yeah, I mean, Ben, the right answer was working with me is the most meaningful thing you've ever done. But think about this podcast. The reason we started this podcast is because we really wanted to impact people and organizations' lives at a much larger scale and scope than we could on a one-on-one consulting engagement basis. And so many of our engagements, we focus on the people because that normally sorts out some of the problems, but it's so problem focused, right?
Right.
Where with the podcast, we can be so much, hey, what can individuals do to impact themselves, their teams, their organizations, and communities? And for me, I don't know, this podcast is really fulfilling.
Sure. There's an interesting other take on meaning at work that I think is important to address. So we talked about some of these positive outcomes that come from having a lot of sense of meaning at work, from your job satisfaction to your performance and your well-being and everything, and that's great. But there actually can be some downsides. It's very interesting. There's a great article that was written a number of years ago in the Administrative Science Quarterly, which is a scholarly journal. But in this study, they studied zookeepers, right? And zookeepers are a really interesting group of people because it's hard work. You have to have a decent amount of education. You have to work hard. There's a lot of people who want to do it. So it's competitive to even get the job. You got to be an intern usually, and eventually maybe you get that job. But you get into it and it's hard, right? And so I'm just going to quote from the abstract from this article because it's a really interesting point, and it's not just a theoretical point. They actually collected data, and it was supported by the data. They said, and I quote, "On one hand, zookeepers with a sense of calling strongly identified with and found broader meaning and significance in their work and occupation. On the other hand, they were more likely to see their work as a moral duty, to sacrifice pay, personal time, and comfort for their work, and to hold their zoo to a higher standard. Results of a survey of zookeepers from 157 different zoos in the US and Canada supported the hypotheses from our emergent theory. These results reveal the ways in which deeply meaningful work can become a double-edged sword," right? So on the one hand, these zookeepers, they see a lot of significance and meaning in what they're doing, but they see it as so important that it's this moral duty that they start sacrificing all these other pieces of their lives. And in that way, deeply meaningful work can be this double-edged sword. I just think it's a really interesting point, and it's something to point out with regard to this topic overall.
Yeah, I mean, it's a suffering servant, but it's a suffering servant for real. It's not like, oh, look at me, look at how I suffer for the people. No, these guys are going in, they're dealing with all kind of animal feces, the general public, they're getting super smart and educated. How people view animals in a zoo determines how they might think about taking care of our environment and world at large. I know, like, my kids super enjoy the zoo. It's, a community is better if they have a zoo. And here they are literally working themselves to the bone with next to no pay. And I think that has some ethical implications for how organizations go. Another thing I think about that we were talking about when we were prepping and talking about this episode is, people that do home health and senior care. Not everybody made $1 bajillion and can just put up their grandparents in like the nicest of digs for their end of life care and stuff. And they still have to work. They probably have kids of their own to do. And yet, so there's a structure that just keeps them low in the pay, right? Because we just can't afford, yet they're doing some of the most important work we could have as a society.
Right. So I think this is kind of a note of caution that, finding meaning in your work is very important, but you don't want to do that at the detriment of your well-being, right? So,
and so we've got to figure out as a society what to do about people and places that are just, it's, I don't know if it's best to have, people changing their senior care job every 3 months for a job with better pay, right?
Yeah, I don't know, and I don't know if that's even a something that could be addressed at the policy level or not. But it's an interesting idea, an interesting conversation. But let's move now to discussing a little bit more about how you might make your work more meaningful, or some things you can do if that's just unlikely, right? Maybe there's only so much you can do. So I think, how to make work more meaningful. One thing you can do is, seek meaning in what you're doing right now.
Yeah, if you just take a moment and pause from the grind, right? Everything's going, typical day, get the kids to school, spill coffee on your shirt on the way to work, all this stuff is happening. It can be hard to find that meaning right there, but it might be there. Right. And I noticed the meaning that people found during this pandemic and during the last time we had the financial crisis blowout back in, the crisis before this crisis. When people weren't at work anymore and they're like, man, I just really, outside of the cash, which is needed, right? I really had a lot of meaning in the social interactions and, going to lunch with Filson every week or, whatever it was.
Yeah. I think this is the first time you've ever talked about Filson in a positive way. Normally, you use this name Filson, and apologies to anyone with the last name or first name there, name Filson. Normally, you use
Google Analytics says Filson only lasts 2 episodes.
That's right, but maybe Filson is your best friend out there. So, seeking meaning in what you're doing right now, there are ways to do this, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about kind of how you can cognitively reframe your work. And I think sometimes we just have to stop and recognize what we're doing and how it can have a bigger impact. There are bad parts to every single job, right? So being a professor, like grading, is not particularly thrilling. Dealing with the various minutia of being a faculty member, I mean that stuff's not great. But there are really big, important parts of it that are pretty awesome. Same thing with our consulting work and everything else. And I think focusing on those pieces that are significant and just reminding yourself of that significance is really great. And to the degree possible, connecting yourself with some of those outcomes. So, for example, as a professor, that's why I like for my students to connect with me on LinkedIn, because then I can see what they do later in life. And that gives me a little sense of meaning and purpose. So I think that's great. But there's this other idea that, hey, okay, you're having trouble figuring out what the significance is in your tasks, how your work can be meaningful. And there's this idea called job crafting, right? I guess it's another neat idea that your job can be kind of malleable to some extent if you actually work at it.
Yeah, I mean, you can get, if you're in a larger organization, they have what's called an ERG or affinity group, employee resource group. People call these different things. You can get involved with some extracurriculars within your job. So they may have something for, say, LGBT people, for people of color. They could have a mentors resource group if you want to find a mentor within your organization. And getting plugged in is a great way to do some of that. Also, just talking to your boss about, hey, if there's any special projects coming down the pike, I'd like to be considered.
Yeah, so job crafting, I think, will deal more with what you said at the end of that sentence about talking to your boss and trying to figure out your job and how you might craft it. Now, getting involved in other things at work, some other extracurriculars, that might give you some meaning as well. But from the book chapter that I talked about earlier, they define this idea of job crafting as follows, and I quote, "Job crafting is a way to think about job design that puts employees in the driver's seat in cultivating meaningfulness in their work. Job crafters can proactively reshape the boundaries of their jobs using 3 categories of job crafting techniques: task, relational, and cognitive crafting." So I think it'd be helpful for our listeners, if they want to have more meaning in their work, for us to talk about these 3 different categories of job crafting. Because guess what? You can be a job crafter and potentially use that to have some more meaning in your work. So let's start with the first one, which is task crafting.
Yeah, that's where you get to the boss and say, it kills me doing this one task for 8 hours. My goodness, and it probably killed you too. So you got promoted as quick as possible, right?
Yeah.
So this is, maybe we could shift. And I've seen done. It's like, hey, me and Philson do different things. If we trained each other on what we do, maybe I could do my job for 4 hours and Philson's job for the next 4 hours. And
so you missed Philson, and now you're cross training with Philson. I just love this development, Chris. Just Philson is a really important person for you.
Well, yeah, he's saving me from doing the same thing for 8 hours.
But you're right. Task crafting is about trying to figure out how you can alter, the responsibilities that are in your job description. Maybe you can add or drop some tasks. Maybe you can change the nature of those tasks. Maybe you can just change the amount of time or energy that you allocate to different pieces. And that could maybe introduce some more meaning and purpose into your work. So that's the first piece, which is task crafting. And I mean, I think before we go too much further, I think just this idea of job crafting requires you to have a little bit of an internal locus of control and realize that, hey, if my work is not meaningful, I can put myself in the driver's seat, and maybe there's something that I can do about it. This is not a throw up your hands in the air and say, woe is me type of strategy. So task crafting is the first piece, and relational crafting, this is where you try to change those, how, when, and with whom you're interacting with other people around your workplace in terms of getting your job done. Maybe this is where you start working more with Philson on some cool project, and that brings you a sense of meaning. So you can look at the tasks, you can look at your relationships, and the last piece is about how you think.
Yeah, well, on the relational crafting side of things, and this isn't necessarily in that what they're thinking, but sometimes you can just say internally focused and customer focused. Hey, to do my job better, I'd like more exposure to the customer. And so You're actually out there navigating in the business environment. If you're an IT help desk worker, maybe you do some help desk, help support, but then maybe you actually get to go to some client sites to do some one-on-one face kind of stuff. So I think about that more broadly of just, yes, who you're having relationships and interactions with in the workplace, but also outside, kind of in a help capacity, if that makes sense.
Right. And one psychological reason why that would work in terms of creating a sense of significance or meaning is sometimes by changing the interactions, like, for example, from just being internally focused to externally focused. I want to see some customers. I want to go along and see some clients. It actually can help broaden your perspective. And then you can start seeing, oh, wow, all these things that we do at work, they actually make a difference for our clients, for our customers. Here's how the big picture kind of fits together. In addition to just adding some variety to what you're doing.
Right. And that was the whole idea of that task significance, right? Where you see the connection between the work you do and its impact on something bigger, which can sometimes be the community or the customers you guys serve.
Right. So we've talked about task crafting and relational crafting. The last piece is cognitive crafting. So this is about changing how you perceive the tasks and relationships that make up your work. So maybe it's not just about, sweeping the floors. It's about, maintaining a healthy environment where everybody can thrive. I'm reminded, I don't even know if this is a true story, but apparently back in the day, President John F. Kennedy was touring NASA after he had said, we're going to put a person on the moon, right? And he was touring NASA, and he apparently came across a member of the janitorial staff and said, what's your job here? And the person who was just cleaning some things said, my job is to put a man on the moon, right?
I love that.
I love the story. I don't know if it's true, but it's a cool story because it's like, hey, I see what I'm doing as connected to something bigger. And that took some cognitive reframing on that person's part. So, I think, and this goes deeper than just tricking yourself. I think it's about finding the connection between what you're doing and something bigger.
Yeah, this idea that, if I just, say enough positive words to myself, or if I just, I'm not a high school janitor, I'm an education enabler, that's not something, you can't fake this stuff. It can't just be that kind of surface thing. But I think anybody that reflects back on their life can think about a time in like school, high school, something like that, when somebody said something that was really meaningful to them. And, you could be that person to somebody else. and help them see. So if you're having a lot of meaning and you look to the person to your left and right and they're not having a lot of meaning, you can help spread some of that meaning. And likewise, if you find somebody next to you, hey, I'm just not feeling this work. How is it you come in every day and feel good about what you're doing? You might be able to get some of that on loan and get it installed into your own OS, right?
Right. And maybe part of the meaning that you have at work is, I don't care about what this company does. The products and services we make are just so meaningless and trivial. But you know what? I care about the person to my left and my right. And we're here on this planet together. And I'm going to be a good teammate. I'm going to be a good person to the people around me. And that brings me meaning, right? So that could be another way in which you increase the meaning that you perceive in your work. Let's imagine that your work stinks. You're not a co-host of the Indigo Podcast or doing other things that bring you tremendous senses of meaning and significance. Let's imagine your work stinks and you want to make it more meaningful. You're saying, all right, Ben and Chris, I believe you. This seems to make sense. I would love to have this. And maybe let's talk more specifically about how you might craft your way to meaningfulness. And talk, insofar as we talk about that, we'll talk about some implications for people, for leaders, and for organizations. So let's start off with the people piece.
Yeah. So as an individual, I find a lot of people are, just floundering. They talk to me about this all the time. And, I'm just floundering in my job. I'm floundering in my job. And one of the things that's really common is, hey, okay, well, let's say you had a magic wand and you could do absolutely anything. Well, what would you do? and right, it's just silence. Like, what? Well, yeah. What if you could do anything? You want to be president. You want to be a pop star. You want to be, a research engineer at NASA. They don't have a concept. And so I think the first thing as an individual, because it's hard to head somewhere if you don't know where you're going, is to just do a bit of a gut check and go on a bit of an existential journey. Things that are going to help you here are going to be some reading from other people who've thought about this kind of problem.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great point. That having a good sense of self and having a strong sense of how you might contribute to the world is certainly a great place to start. And one way to do that is through exposing yourself to other types of stories and people who have done that in their lives. I mean, you and I both read quite a bit, and we had childhoods that were filled with books. That's kind of one way to do it as well, right? You can learn vicariously or get ideas vicariously through others.
And here's the thing at that. So if you can't think of, if you had a magic wand, what would make you happy, you may actually not want to just jet off to another job or talking to your boss about different tasks. You might want to just sit with that for a minute. Yeah. So you have a direction that you're going so you don't waste time spinning out. The second thing that I see is stuff where, you know what, I was just so focused on making more money.
Yeah.
And so there's this idea called hedonic adaptation. So, somebody gets a big raise or they win the lottery. There's like 3 or 6 months later, they're right back to their default level of happiness and satisfaction. And so you want to make sure, right? You can get lost in this. You want to make sure that this is a place you can actually go to.
Yeah. You mentioned as you can get lost in this. I think a lot of people get lost in this.
Yeah,
right? I mean,
they got the country club membership. They got $1 billion in the bank. They got, the picture perfect family that would, they use for the stock photo at the Target frame, picture frame.
But we're not just talking about billionaires here, though.
Yeah,
I mean, we're talking about a lot of people out there who think that they're going to get their sense of happiness and significance through the acquisition of money or through
toys,
boats, right. I think there's a
trucks.
Good, there's always a bigger boat, and keeping that in mind is important. Remembering that, it's not necessarily going to bring you a sense of meaningfulness. We come across a lot of people who make a lot of money who are pretty miserable.
Yeah. And if you're not careful, because, right, this is a personal journey, a personal thing you have to do. If you have an operating system in your mind that no matter what happened to you, a couple months later, you're not going to be happy again, that journey doesn't need to be about necessarily meaningful work outside because, right, we talked about it. Like you can bring your meaning with you to work or you go showing up and other people have to create that meaning. Now that might be okay if the kind of meaning they create just works for you. If it gets you there, hey, if you're happy, just stay happy. That's great. If you feel meaning, don't wait a minute. Should I be worried about a boat now? No, that's not what you want. Yeah, you're good. Be good. Don't let anybody ruin that for you. But if you're a person that just keeps changing jobs all the time, or if you just keep going after that promotion because you need some affirmation and more cash in your bank, and it's never enough, it's never enough, it's never enough, you've got to go on an existential journey inside to figure out how might I be at peace with myself at this moment.
Right. So, let's go back and talk a little bit more specifically about, let's say you've done the existential journey and you're like, all right, I get that. I want to maybe try some of this job crafting stuff.
If you're not a jacked up investment banker with a minor drug problem, let's talk about task focus, right? So, add some tasks.
Right.
Maybe try to fill if you do your job crafting, have a larger portion of your day be done on the tasks that you enjoy rather than maybe filing those receipts for your expense report all day.
That's right. I have found, I've just learned about myself that I tend to get bored after I've mastered tasks. Once I've figured something out and I can do it really well, I can turn the crank on those things and keep doing them. But, I figure out ways to make my work interesting. So, for example, every couple times oftentimes when I teach a course, it's a lot of work to teach a course for the first time and put it all together and design it. And then you do it a couple times and I find I'm getting a little bored and you know what? I could probably do a few things better. Then I kind of redesign it and I make it better. So that's one way that I job craft, and that's completely, up to me to do. But if you're in a job that's not, the strange job of being a professor, you could add some tasks. You could go to your boss and say, look, I want to expand the variety of my work. I want to, maybe learn something different.
You could teach. Yeah. Teaching's a great one. Hey, you know what? I'm probably the best on my team at this. I'd love to be in charge of training new employees in their onboarding. Is that cool?
Yeah. No, that's great. That's a great one. So you can have this task focus in terms of job crafting that could help you. And don't be worried at this point, I don't think, too much about your job description. Like there are essential parts of your job that you're not gonna want to go to your boss and say, hey, I'm gonna quit doing everything that you explicitly hired me to do. Can I do something else? I mean, that's an extreme type of approach. But there are probably some things that you could do differently. The next piece is about your relationship focus. And I think this is great because we derive so much of our meaning and significance from the people around us and the relationships that we build around us. So, you can craft better interactions with the people around you, build those relationships. Maybe you don't really know the people you work with very much, and you can do that a little bit. That can give you some meaning and purpose because then your work isn't just about showing up and doing things. It's about showing up and helping each other, doing different things that make life as a collective more meaningful.
Right. And this is the idea of, a lot of things that people get annoyed with in the workplace is I'm just, like that Pink Floyd song, another brick in the wall, I'm just a cog in the machine. Well, stop. Humanize your workplace and your environment. Stop seeing the person in the cubicle next to you as somebody you have transactions with, right? This is a real person with hopes, fears, dreams, children, pets, all that kind of thing. Find out who they are. Get to know each other. Now, you do have to keep it professional, but there's lots of people, Ben, we have lots of really in-depth, close, personal friendships with people that we also interact with professionally, and it's fine. You just got to do both of those items.
Right. Another thing that you can do is kind of adapt your relationships. And this actually, you mentioned something earlier that kind of made me think of this is maybe you are a little bit more experienced in a certain area. Maybe you've been around your organization for a while. Maybe you could start being a mentor, right? And start training other people. It's interesting in the research on mentoring that a lot of the research focused initially on benefits for the person being mentored, the protege, the mentee, whatever you want to call that person. And there certainly are a lot of benefits. But there are also benefits to the person doing the mentoring. They find a lot of satisfaction out of it. This could be another thing that gives you purpose and meaning in your work. Maybe you've gotten to a point in your career where it's like, you know what? My chances of getting promoted probably aren't that great, or maybe I don't really want to get promoted because I'm kind of happy with being at my certain level of responsibility. But you know what? Maybe my purpose and meaning in my job, in my career, can now come from grooming and building the next generation of talent in my profession or in my industry or in my organization.
That's something that gives me a lot of meaning, Ben, is because I've spent countless hours reading, countless hours working with organizations, I don't want that to die with me, right?
Mm-hmm.
I want to teach other people how to do the things that we do in organizations so they can build their own lives, their own families, their own communities to be better, stronger from an evidence-based perspective, and so that they can create mentors. And so when I'm gone from this earth, right, there's just this virtuous cycle that's going out from all the people that I've touched. Knock on wood,
Mm-hmm. Right. So another thing that you can do in terms of job crafting is have a focus on your perceptions. So expanding your perceptions. For example, going back to the zookeepers, seeing your job, which is admittedly fairly dirty, both kind of, in a very real way and in other ways, but also seeing as one of, there is some moral duty there and you're doing something for animal welfare at writ large. You can also focus your perceptions. Maybe you narrow your mental energy to more specifically hone in on a specific area of your work. So those are more cognitive types of things that you can do.
Right. And then also just look for those small wins.
Yeah.
Right. So we know from the data on hedonic adaptation that you can be handed something really big and you'll move back to your default level of happiness. Now, I know meaningful work is not necessarily, happiness is not what we're necessarily focused on. But when we look at meaningful work, sometimes that's just stringing the small wins along. And then the small wins lead to bigger wins. Right? The journey of 1,000,000 miles starts with a single step kind of thing. Just start stacking up those small wins in your day to day.
Awesome. So let's move now from the individual focus and talk a little bit more about leaders and kind of at the organizational level and things that they can do, some implications for them with regard to meaningful work. I guess the first question I have is, some people may be listening and thinking, you know what? Okay, I'm a leader, I'm a manager, I have a formal position of authority. And I have, responsibilities and things that I've got to deliver on. Why do I now have to care about the people around me finding meaning in their work? This is horrible. Like, can't we just focus on the work?
Yeah, well, and maybe that's driving you to automation quicker. It's like, yeah, if we could just get robots in here, my life would be so much better. Just go look in the mirror and just say what you just said to yourself. Oh my God, you best fix yourself, buddy. Listen, and you can't fake this. All these items, so many of the articles that we looked at is like, oh, this is a good retention strategy. This will create engaged employees that will make you money. Whatever happened to, this is the kind of world I want to live in. I want meaningful work for myself. Why would I not want to share meaningful work with the others around me?
Yeah. There are so many things in the workplace that kind of have those two different reasons for doing them, right? There's I can be a nice manager, I can be a relatable leader and all that kind of stuff. And that will lead to better performance and increased productivity and commitment and everything. And that's great. There are business reasons why these are good ideas, but to your point, Chris, it's also about how I want the world to be and how I want to be a part of the world. And I think, taking a little bit of that responsibility is great. I think it's a good thing for all of us to do. It's not easy necessarily, right? Because, if you want people to have a meaningful experience at work, if you want to develop good relationships with the people around you, it takes some work. It may, it's in addition to or alongside your other responsibilities. It takes some time, but you know what? It makes the world more meaningful for us to live in.
This is the meaningful work that is available to anybody.
Yeah.
What do I do every day? Well, I take the papers from this pile and I shuffle them to that pile. And then after 2 p.m., I take it from that pile and shuffle it back onto my pile. What do you do at the other days? Pretty much the same thing. That might be really hard to find some meaning there.
Right.
But the meaningful work that's available for anybody to pick up right now is the creating meaning for people around us. Parents do this every Christmas. No matter where you are in the world, there's some kind of holiday where you do really cool stuff with kids. And you might have a little bit of mythology wrapped up around it. I mean, Santa Claus is real, so we're not talking about that. But the meaning we create for our children on these magical holidays is meaningful work. And yet we can do that for ourselves. We can do that for the people around us on our teams. If you're a HR leader or something like that, you can be looking out. You can add some of those meaning questions into your annual surveys and those kinds of things. This is something that everybody should be wanting to do at their work, in their communities, their places of worship, and those kinds of things.
Right. And, maybe your work, you're thinking about this stuff and you're like, you know what, there's just no way that I'm going to craft my job to make it better. Everyone here is terrible, so the relationship piece is out. I can't even think differently about my job, so the job crafting piece is not going to work for me in terms of meaningfulness. And you know what? Okay. As long as you're not doing a job that is unethical in and of itself, I don't really have a problem with it.
Please don't be a narco-terrorist.
Yeah,
that would be bad.
That would be bad. Absolutely. But there are other ways to find meaning and purpose in life and have meaningful work outside of your actual job. And this is a beautiful thing about, nonprofit work, about work in your community. There are many different ways in which you can contribute and really have a lot of meaning. And then maybe you're not as dependent upon your employment for that purpose.
Yeah. And, there's kind of 4 lenses to think about this. And, this is all over the web. Everybody has their take on this. But there's this idea of looking inwards towards existential excellence. So that could be finding peace with yourself rather than having to chase that next promotion, that next dollar, that kind of thing. Being morally, in Scouts, we call it being morally straight, right? Making sure that you are who you say you are. So many people we run into say, well, I'm really suffering from imposter syndrome. And then you look and you're like, well, you are an imposter, but that's okay. You can start that journey right now to being who you say you are. Right? Living up to your values, having integrity in how you conduct yourself. And then there's this other idea, this idea of, so you can perfect yourself, you can perfect what you do. And this is kind of that idea of craftsmanship. You become better and better to where the skills or your profession becomes almost an art and you keep honing it better and better and better.
Right. Yeah. So, finding those different ways to interact with people in a better way, to make your work, if you can, more meaningful. All of these tie into this idea of meaningful work. And it's just such a huge part of our meaningful existence because, be it in the workplace or whatever, having a meaningful life is important. For you, for selfish reasons, it is important because you will be sitting, thinking about your life at some point, and it makes a difference for your satisfaction and for your sense of peace to have had those meaningful experiences.
Right. So the other 2 lenses there, it's so you've got looking inward, kind of an existential excellence, idea of craftsmanship, perfecting what you do. You can do society better, creating those meaningful relationships, doing relationships better. And that can be being a friend to somebody in a time of need, being a friend to somebody who doesn't have any friends, those kinds of things. And then the other thing is doing for others. And this can be your charity engagement. This could be employee care. So if you work in a small company or, any size company really, and you start caring for others really, so you have that professional relationship, but you're also, hey, you guys haven't been on a date. If you'd like, I'd be happy to come over, or you could drop your kids off at my house for dinner so you could go out. There's all these humanizing things that we can do, that doing for others, food bank work, soup kitchen, those kinds of things can create meaning because we're more than just the hours at our job.
Awesome. So today on the Indigo Podcast, we have talked about the search for meaningful work and what to do if your work stinks. We've talked about what meaningful work is and why it matters, how to make work more meaningful, or what to do if that's unlikely, and we talked about some implications for people, leaders, and organizations. Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.